The rain was hitting the windows of the small London apartment as James Morrison sat at his kitchen table, staring at the brown envelope in front of him. His hands were shaking slightly, something that never happened during his 15 years of protecting the most important people in Britain. But tonight was different. Tonight, everything he believed in was falling apart. James had always been proud of his job. When people asked what he did for a living, he would smile and say he worked in security. He never mentioned the royal family directly, but his friends knew. The way he carried himself, the way he spoke about duty and honor, it was obvious he was involved in something important. His mother used to joke that he was more loyal to the crown than some members of the royal family themselves. She wasn't wrong. James had started working for the Royal Protection Unit when he was just 22 years old. Fresh out of military training, he was eager to serve his country in a meaningful way. The job wasn't glamorous like people might think. Most days were spent standing for hours watching, waiting, making sure nothing went wrong. He had protected prime ministers, foreign dignitaries, and eventually members of the royal family. Over the years, James had seen things that would make headlines around the world. Private arguments, family disagreements, moments of weakness that even royals experience. But he never spoke about any of it. That was the job. That was what made him good at what he did. His supervisors trusted him completely, and the royal family felt safe around him because they knew he would never betray their confidence. The apartment around him was simple but clean. A small living room with a television, a kitchen just big enough for one person, and a bedroom with barely enough space for a bed and a wardrobe. James had never needed much. His life was about service, not luxury. The only expensive thing in the apartment was the watch his colleagues had given him when he reached 10 years of service. It was sitting on the table next to the envelope, ticking quietly in the silence. James picked up the envelope and felt its weight. Inside were photographs, documents, and a small recording device. Everything that could prove what he had witnessed over the past 6 months. Everything that could destroy the reputation of someone he was supposed to protect. Everything that could end his career and possibly put his life in danger. He remembered the first time he noticed something was wrong. It was a Tuesday evening in October, and he was stationed outside Queen Camilla's private study at Clarence House. This was routine work. Stand outside, make sure no one who shouldn't be there got close, and report anything unusual. But that night he heard voices that didn't sound like the usual polite conversations he was used to hearing. The Queen was on the phone, but her voice was different. Colder, more calculating. James couldn't make out all the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the voice of someone who was used to getting their way, no matter what it took. It was the voice of someone who saw people as tools to be used rather than human beings to be respected. At first, James tried to convince himself he was imagining things. Maybe the Queen was just having a bad day. Maybe she was dealing with some difficult situation that required a firm approach. After all, being married to the king couldn't be easy. There were probably pressures and responsibilities that ordinary people like James couldn't understand. But as the weeks went by, he started noticing more things. The way certain staff members would look nervous when the Queen was around. The way some of the king's oldest friends stopped visiting. The way important letters seemed to disappear before reaching the king. Small things that individually meant nothing, but together painted a picture that made James very uncomfortable. James had always believed that the royal family, despite their human flaws, were fundamentally good people trying to do their best for the country. He had seen King Charles during private moments, and the man seemed genuinely caring and thoughtful. He worried about his subjects, spent time reading letters from ordinary citizens, and often stayed up late working on speeches that he hoped would help bring the country together. But something was changing in the royal household, and James was starting to realize that the Queen might be at the center of it. The woman who smiled warmly at public events and gave speeches about charity and kindness seemed to be a very different person when the cameras weren't rolling. The breaking point came 3 weeks ago. James was doing his usual security check of the communications equipment when he discovered something that made his blood run cold. There were recordings of private conversations between the king and his doctors, conversations that the Queen had no business listening to. But not only was she listening, she was using the information in ways that seemed designed to help her, not her husband. That night, James went home and couldn't sleep. He sat in his small kitchen, drinking tea and trying to figure out what to do. His whole life had been built around loyalty and duty. He had sworn an oath to protect the royal family, but what happened when protecting one member meant exposing another? What happened when the person you were supposed to protect was the one causing the harm? James looked at his phone, which was sitting silent on the table. He had been thinking about making a call for weeks now, but every time he picked up the phone, he put it down again. Once he made that call, there would be no going back. His life as he knew it would be over. His career would be finished. His reputation would be destroyed. Some people would call him a hero, but others would call him a traitor. The worst part was that James genuinely liked Queen Camilla as a person, at least the version of her he had known for years. She was always polite to the staff, remembered people's names, and seemed to care about the work she was doing for various charities. But the woman he had been observing over the past few months seemed like a completely different person. It was as if she had been wearing a mask all along, and now that she felt secure in her position, she was letting it slip. James opened the envelope and looked at the contents one more time. Everything was there. Everything that would prove that Queen Camilla was not the person the public thought she was. Everything that would show that the monarchy itself might be in danger from someone who was supposed to be protecting it. He closed the envelope and picked up his phone. Tomorrow he would make the call that would change everything. Tonight he would try to get some sleep, knowing it might be the last peaceful night he would have for a very long time. The rain continued to hit his windows, and somewhere across London, the royal family slept peacefully, unaware that one of their most trusted protectors was about to become their greatest threat. October 15th started like any other Tuesday at Clarence House. James Morrison arrived at work at 6 a.m., just as he had done almost every day for the past 3 years. The morning briefing was routine. The weather was typical London grey, and nothing in the schedule suggested that this day would be any different from hundreds of others. James had been assigned to evening duty that day, which meant he would be responsible for security during the Queen's private dinner. It was supposed to be a quiet affair, just Queen Camilla and a few close advisors discussing some upcoming charity events. James had overseen dozens of similar meetings, and they were usually pleasant, civilized discussions about how to make the world a better place. As the afternoon turned into evening, James took his position outside the Queen's private study. The room was on the second floor of Clarence House, and from his post in the hallway, he could monitor everyone who came and went. It was a comfortable assignment, the kind that experienced guards like James were given because they could be trusted to stay alert, even when nothing exciting was happening. The first guest arrived at 7 o'clock sharp. It was Lady Patricia Thornton, an elderly woman who had been involved with royal charities for decades. James had seen her many times before, and she always seemed like a genuinely kind person who cared deeply about helping others. She nodded politely to James as she passed, and he opened the door to announce her arrival. The second guest was Dr. Robert Hayes, the Queen's private physician. This was slightly unusual because medical appointments were typically scheduled during daytime hours, but James didn't think much of it. Perhaps the Queen was feeling unwell, or maybe the doctor was there in a social capacity. The third guest was someone James had never seen before. A tall, thin man in an expensive suit who introduced himself simply as Mr. Thompson. He carried a briefcase and had the kind of serious expression that suggested he was there on important business. James made a mental note to check the visitor log later, as he was supposed to be aware of everyone who entered the building. Once all the guests were inside, James settled into his usual routine. He stood quietly outside the door, occasionally walking the length of the hallway to check that everything was secure. The building was well protected with security cameras and alarm systems throughout, but James knew that the human element was still the most important part of keeping people safe. At first, the conversation inside sounded normal. James could hear the gentle murmur of voices discussing what sounded like routine charity business. Lady Thornton's voice was the most distinctive, with her posh accent and enthusiastic tone when talking about helping disadvantaged children. Dr. Hayes spoke less frequently, but when he did, it was in the measured, professional tone that James had come to expect from medical professionals. But as the evening progressed, something changed. James noticed that Queen Camilla's voice was becoming more prominent in the conversation, and her tone was shifting. Gone was the warm, motherly voice that the public knew so well. Instead, James heard something that made him uncomfortable, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Around 9 o'clock, James heard something that made him stop in his tracks. The Queen was speaking to Mr. Thompson, and her voice had become cold and businesslike. She was talking about someone James realized was King Charles, but she wasn't speaking like a loving wife. She was speaking like someone discussing a problem that needed to be solved. James found himself moving closer to the door, something he had never done before in his career. Professional guards were trained to give their clients privacy while still maintaining security. But something about the conversation was making his instincts scream that something was wrong. What he heard next changed everything. The Queen was discussing the King's schedule, but not in the way James expected. She wasn't talking about making sure he got enough rest or had time for the things he enjoyed. Instead, she seemed to be planning ways to keep him busier, more tired and more dependent on her for information about what was happening around him. Dr. Hayes was contributing to this conversation in a way that made James's stomach turn. The doctor was talking about the King's medications, but instead of discussing how to help him feel better, they seemed to be talking about how to manage his energy levels and mental clarity. James couldn't believe what he was hearing. Were they actually discussing ways to keep the King from being at his best? Mr. Thompson was taking notes throughout this conversation, and James realized that whatever was being planned was serious enough to require documentation. This wasn't just casual conversation between friends. This was a meeting with an agenda, and that agenda seemed to involve controlling the King of England. The most disturbing part came when Lady Thornton, who James had always respected, began talking about the King's friends and advisors. She was describing them not as valuable counselors who helped the King make good decisions, but as obstacles that needed to be removed. James heard her suggesting ways to gradually exclude certain people from royal circles, making it seem natural rather than deliberate. As James listened, he began to understand that he was witnessing something that went far beyond normal royal politics. This wasn't about different opinions on policy or charity work. This was about a systematic plan to isolate the King and increase the Queen's control over his life and decisions. The conversation continued for another hour, and James heard details that made him question everything he thought he knew about the royal family. They discussed ways to monitor the King's phone calls, control his access to certain information, and even manipulate his relationships with his children. It was like listening to people plan a very sophisticated form of psychological imprisonment. When the meeting finally ended around 10:30, James watched the guests leave with a completely different perspective than when they had arrived. Lady Thornton still looked like a sweet elderly woman, but now James knew she was capable of planning something that could harm the King. Dr. Hayes still looked professional and trustworthy, but James now understood that his loyalty might not be where it should be. Mr. Thompson left without saying anything to James, but as he passed, James noticed that his briefcase looked heavier than when he had arrived. Whatever had been planned during that meeting, it was important enough to require extensive documentation. After everyone had gone, James remained at his post until his shift ended at midnight. But his mind was racing, replaying everything he had heard and trying to make sense of it all. He had always known that royal life involved politics and complex relationships, but he had never imagined that he might witness something that seemed designed to harm the King himself. As James finally left Clarence's house that night, he looked back at the building where he had worked faithfully for years. It still looked the same from the outside, but something fundamental had changed. The place he had always seen as a symbol of duty and service now felt like the setting for something much darker. Walking through the quiet London streets toward his apartment, James couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed the beginning of something terrible. The question was, what was he going to do about it? After that disturbing Tuesday night meeting, James Morrison found himself paying attention to things he had never noticed before. It was like someone had given him a new pair of glasses that suddenly made everything crystal clear. What he saw over the following weeks made him realize that the meeting wasn't a one-time event. It was part of something much bigger and more carefully planned. The first thing James noticed was how the King's daily routine was slowly changing. For years, King Charles had maintained certain habits that seemed to keep him grounded and happy. He enjoyed his morning walks in the garden, reading letters from citizens, and having tea with old friends who had known him since before he became king. These simple pleasures seemed to give him energy and help him stay connected to the real world outside of royal duties. But gradually, James watched as these routines were being disrupted. The morning walks became shorter and less frequent, because suddenly there were always urgent meetings that couldn't wait. The letters from citizens were still delivered to the king's office, but James noticed that many of them were being filtered through the Queen's staff first. And the old friends who used to visit regularly were finding it increasingly difficult to get appointments. James started keeping a small notebook, something he had never done before in his career. He wrote down times when the king's schedule was changed at the last minute, when visits from friends were canceled, and when meetings were rearranged in ways that seemed designed to keep the king busier and more tired than necessary. After just 2 weeks of note-taking, James could see a clear pattern emerging. The Queen's influence was everywhere, but it was subtle. She never gave direct orders or made obvious demands. Instead, she made suggestions that sounded reasonable and caring. She would mention that the king looked tired and perhaps should skip his walk to get more rest. She would note that a particular friend hadn't visited in a while, and maybe it was time to focus on newer relationships. She would point out that reading all those citizen letters was emotionally draining, and perhaps staff could summarize the important ones instead. Each suggestion by itself seemed harmless, even thoughtful, but James was starting to see how they all worked together to gradually isolate the king from the things and people that had always been important to him. It was like watching someone slowly build a wall around another person, one brick at a time, making it seem like they were building a protective shelter rather than a prison. One afternoon, James witnessed something that made his blood run cold. Lord David Hutchinson, one of the king's oldest and closest friends, had come for what he thought was a scheduled lunch meeting. James had seen Lord Hutchinson visit dozens of times over the years, and the king always seemed genuinely happy to see him. They would laugh together, share stories, and talk about everything from politics to gardening. But on this particular day, when Lord Hutchinson arrived, the Queen's private secretary met him at the door instead of the usual protocol. The secretary explained that the king was feeling unwell and needed to rest, so the lunch would have to be postponed. Lord Hutchinson looked concerned and asked if there was anything he could do to help, but he was politely but firmly told that the best thing he could do was give the king some space to recover. The strange thing was that James had seen the king just an hour earlier, and he had seemed perfectly fine. He wasn't sick or tired or stressed. In fact, he had been looking forward to the lunch because James had heard him mention it to his personal staff that morning. But now suddenly he was too unwell to see one of his dearest friends. After Lord Hutchinson left, looking confused and worried, James watched as the Queen emerged from a different part of the building. She had clearly been there the entire time, but she had chosen not to greet the king's friend or explain the situation herself. Instead, she had allowed her staff to handle what should have been a personal conversation between friends. This pattern repeated itself over and over again in the following days. Friends would arrive for scheduled meetings only to be told that the king was unavailable. Important advisors would be redirected to speak with the Queen's staff, instead of the king directly. Even family members seemed to be having difficulty getting private time with him. James began to notice how the Queen positioned herself in these situations. She was always nearby when these cancellations happened, but she never appeared to be directly involved. Her staff would make the excuses, her secretary would reschedule the meetings, and her advisors would handle the explanations. But James could see that nothing happened without her knowledge and approval. The most disturbing part was watching how this affected the king himself. James had been around him long enough to recognize his moods and energy levels, and he could see that the isolation was taking a toll. The king seemed more dependent on his wife for information about what was happening in the world around him. He was asking fewer questions and making fewer independent decisions. He was starting to defer to the Queen's judgment on matters where he had previously been confident in his own opinions. James also noticed changes in the household staff. People who had worked for the royal family for years were becoming more cautious about what they said and did. There was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before, as if everyone was walking on eggshells. Staff members who used to chat casually with each other were now more formal and reserved. It was as if they sensed that they were being watched and judged more carefully than before. One evening, James overheard a conversation between two senior staff members that confirmed his suspicions. They were discussing how certain protocols had been quietly changed, giving the Queen's office more control over the King's schedule and communications. What troubled James most was that these changes hadn't been announced or explained. They had simply been implemented gradually, so subtly that most people hadn't even noticed they were happening. The staff members were clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but they also seemed afraid to speak up about it. One of them mentioned that a colleague who had questioned some of the new procedures had suddenly been transferred to a different department. The message was clear: don't ask too many questions. If you want to keep your job. James realized that the Queen had created a system where she could control almost every aspect of the King's life while making it appear as if she was simply being a supportive and caring wife. She had surrounded herself with people who were either loyal to her personally or too afraid to challenge her decisions, and she had gradually removed or marginalized anyone who might encourage the King to be more independent. The most frightening part was how effective it was. To anyone looking from the outside, the royal couple seemed happy and unified. The Queen appeared devoted to her husband, always by his side at public events, always ready with a supportive smile or encouraging word. But James now understood that this public image was hiding something much more sinister. As James watched this pattern unfold day after day, he began to understand that he wasn't just witnessing marital politics or even normal royal power struggles. He was watching a systematic campaign to control and isolate the King of England, carried out by the person who should have been his greatest supporter and protector. The weight of this knowledge was becoming unbearable. But James knew that what he had seen so far was probably just the beginning. If the Queen was willing to go this far to control her husband, what else might she be capable of? 3 weeks after James had started keeping his notebook, something happened that made everything else seem small in comparison. It was a quiet Thursday morning when he overheard a conversation that would haunt him for the rest of his life. What he discovered wasn't just about isolation or control anymore. It was about something far more dangerous and personal. James was doing his routine security check of the communication equipment in the Queen's private office when he heard voices coming from the adjacent room. This wasn't unusual, as the Queen often had meetings throughout the day. But something about the tone of the conversation made him pause and listen more carefully. Dr. Hayes was there again, which had become more common in recent weeks. James had initially thought this was because the King might be having health issues, which wouldn't be surprising given his age and the stress of his position. But as James listened to the conversation, he realized that the King's health wasn't the focus of the discussion. Instead, it seemed like his health was being treated as an opportunity. The Queen was asking very specific questions about the King's medications, but these weren't the concerned questions of a loving wife worried about her husband's well-being. These were calculated questions about how different medications might affect his energy levels, his ability to concentrate, and his overall mental sharpness. James felt sick as he realized what he was hearing. Dr. Hayes was explaining how certain medications could be adjusted to achieve specific effects. He talked about how some combinations might make the King feel more tired during the day, making him more likely to rely on others for decision-making. He mentioned other medications that could affect memory and concentration, making it harder for the King to follow complex discussions or remember details from previous conversations. What made James's hands shake was hearing the Queen ask about these effects, as if they were desirable outcomes. She wasn't asking how to help her husband feel better or stronger. She was asking how to make him more dependent and less capable of independent thought. It was like listening to someone plan to slowly poison another person, not to kill them, but to control them. The conversation continued for over an hour, and James heard details that made him question everything he thought he knew about medical ethics and professional responsibility. Dr. Hayes wasn't just answering the Queen's questions. He was making suggestions about how to implement these changes gradually, so that the King wouldn't notice what was happening to him. They discussed timing the medication changes with periods of high stress or busy schedules, so that any negative effects would seem like natural responses to pressure, rather than the result of medical manipulation. They talked about how to explain increased fatigue or confusion as normal signs of aging, making it seem like the King's declining sharpness was inevitable rather than artificially induced. James learned that this had been going on for months. The King's increasing dependence on his wife, His willingness to defer to her judgment and his reduced interest in maintaining his old friendships weren't just the result of social isolation. They were also the result of carefully managed medical intervention designed to make him less capable of independent thinking. The most chilling part of the conversation came when Dr. Hayes mentioned other doctors who had previously treated the king. Apparently, several medical professionals had been gradually phased out of the king's care, replaced by practitioners who were more willing to follow the queen's preferences rather than focusing solely on what was best for their patient. James heard the queen express satisfaction that they had successfully removed Dr. Williams, the king's longtime physician who had apparently been asking too many questions about the treatment plan. Dr. Williams had been replaced by Dr. Hayes, who seemed much more willing to prioritize the queen's wishes over standard medical practice. The conversation also revealed that the king's medical records were being carefully managed to hide what was really happening. Certain information was being omitted from official reports, and some test results were being interpreted in ways that supported the narrative of natural decline rather than revealing the truth about medication effects. James realized that if anyone ever investigated the king's medical care, they would find records that appeared completely normal and appropriate. The manipulation was being hidden behind legitimate medical procedures and documented in ways that made everything seem routine and necessary. As the meeting continued, James heard them planning future adjustments to the king's treatment. They discussed increasing certain medications during important political periods, ensuring that the king would be less sharp during crucial decision-making moments. They talked about how to time these changes with public appearances, so that any signs of confusion or fatigue would be attributed to the demands of royal duty rather than medical interference. The queen also expressed interest in expanding this approach to include dietary supplements and vitamins, creating additional opportunities to influence the king's mental and physical state. Dr. Hayes assured her that these changes could be implemented gradually and would be virtually impossible to detect without extensive testing that would never be conducted as long as he remained the king's primary physician. What frightened James most was hearing how confident and casual they sounded. This wasn't a desperate conversation between people planning something risky and dangerous. This was a routine discussion between collaborators who had been working together successfully for months and were now planning to expand their efforts. James also learned that there were other people involved in this conspiracy beyond just the Queen and Dr. Hayes. They mentioned a pharmacist who was helping to ensure that the right medications were available and properly prepared. They discussed a nurse who was helping to monitor the king's responses to treatment and report back on his condition. The conversation revealed that the Queen had essentially created a shadow medical team whose primary loyalty was to her rather than to their patient. These medical professionals were being paid well for their cooperation, and they were also being protected from any potential legal consequences by carefully documented procedures that made their actions appear legitimate. As James listened to all of this, he felt physically ill. He had spent his entire career protecting people, and now he was learning that someone he was supposed to protect was systematically harming someone else he was supposed to protect. The moral complexity of the situation was overwhelming, but the facts were clear. The Queen was using medical manipulation to control and diminish her husband. The meeting finally ended with plans for the next phase of treatment. James heard them schedule another meeting for the following week to review the king's response to recent medication changes and plan further adjustments. They discussed how to handle any potential complications and what to do if the king or anyone else began to suspect what was happening. After Dr. Hayes left, James remained hidden in the adjacent room, trying to process what he had just heard. He realized that everything he had observed over the past few weeks, all the changes in the king's behavior and decision-making, could be explained not just by social isolation, but by deliberate medical intervention designed to make him less capable and more dependent. James looked at his notebook, which suddenly seemed inadequate for documenting something this serious. He wasn't just witnessing political manipulation anymore. He was witnessing what could only be described as a form of medical abuse, carried out by professionals who had sworn to do no harm, but were instead using their knowledge and access to gradually destroy their patients' independence and cognitive abilities. The weight of this knowledge felt crushing, but James knew that what he had learned changed everything. This wasn't just about protecting the monarchy from political manipulation. This was about protecting the king from people who were supposed to be caring for him, but were instead slowly poisoning his mind and body for their own purposes. James Morrison had thought the medical conspiracy was the worst thing he would discover, but he was wrong. 2 weeks later, his security clearance gave him access to information that revealed another layer of the Queen's activities, one that involved stealing from the very people the royal family was supposed to help. It started when James was asked to help with a routine security audit of the royal financial systems. This was standard procedure that happened every few months, designed to make sure that all the computer systems and filing cabinets containing sensitive financial information were properly protected. James had done this type of work many times before, and it was usually boring but straightforward. His job was to check that all the locks were working properly, that the security cameras had clear views of important areas, and that only authorized people had access to financial records. But this time, as he was checking the computer systems in the Queen's private office, he noticed something that didn't look right. There was a computer file that seemed to be hidden in a way that most people wouldn't notice. James had been trained to spot these kinds of irregularities, because sometimes criminals try to hide information on computers they shouldn't have access to. His instinct told him to investigate further, even though the file was probably just a backup or temporary document. When James opened the file, he found himself looking at financial records that made no sense. There were transactions involving royal charities, but the money wasn't going where it was supposed to go. Instead of being used for the charitable purposes that donors had intended, large amounts of money were being transferred to private accounts that had nothing to do with helping people in need. At first, James thought he might be misunderstanding what he was looking at. Financial records could be complicated, and maybe there were legitimate reasons for moving money between different accounts. But as he studied the documents more carefully, he realized that what he was seeing was systematic theft from charitable organizations. The Queen had apparently been using her position to redirect donations meant for worthy causes. Money that people had given to help sick children was being transferred to accounts controlled by her family members. Funds intended for disaster relief were being used to pay for luxury expenses that had nothing to do with charity work. Donations meant to support education programs were disappearing into private investments. James found records showing that this had been going on for years, long before most people even knew that Camilla would become queen. She had been building a network of fake charities and shell companies that allowed her to steal money while making it look like legitimate charitable work. The paperwork was so cleverly designed that anyone doing a casual audit would think everything was normal. But James's security training had taught him to look for patterns that might indicate criminal activity, and the patterns he was seeing were unmistakable. Money would come in from legitimate donors, stay in the official charity accounts just long enough to be recorded properly, and then be transferred out to accounts that were controlled by people close to the Queen. The amounts involved were staggering. James calculated that over the past 5 years, millions of pounds had been stolen from charities that were supposed to be helping some of the most vulnerable people in society. Money that should have been building schools, providing medical care, and feeding hungry families was instead being used to enrich the Queen and her associates. James discovered that the Queen had been particularly clever about targeting charities that worked with people who couldn't easily complain or investigate when help didn't arrive. She focused on organizations that helped refugees, homeless people, and individuals with serious medical conditions. These were people who often didn't have the resources or connections needed to question why promised aid never materialized. The documentation James found showed that the Queen had been forging signatures on financial documents, creating fake invoices for services that were never provided, and even setting up entire fictional charity programs that existed only on paper. She had been using her royal status to convince people to donate money to causes that sounded legitimate but were actually just ways to funnel cash into her personal accounts. One particularly disturbing discovery was a series of emails between the Queen and her financial advisor, a man named Mr. Richardson, who seemed to be the mastermind behind the technical aspects of the scheme. These emails showed that they had been deliberately targeting charities during times of crisis, when people were most generous with their donations and least likely to ask detailed questions about how their money was being used. James read about how they had exploited natural disasters, terrorist attacks, and even the COVID pandemic to raise money for fake relief efforts. While people across the country were struggling financially and still trying to help those less fortunate, the Queen was stealing their generosity and using it to fund her own lifestyle. The emails also revealed that the Queen had been pressuring other members of the royal family to promote these fake charities at public events. She had been using their good reputations and genuine desire to help people as cover for her criminal activities. James realized that some of the other royals might not even know that the charities they were promoting were actually sophisticated theft operations. James found evidence that the Queen had been blackmailing some of the people involved in her scheme. She had been collecting compromising information about her co-conspirators, ensuring that they couldn't expose her activities without destroying themselves. This explained why so many people were willing to participate in something that was clearly illegal and morally wrong. The financial records also showed that the Queen had been using stolen charity money to buy silence from people who might otherwise have exposed her other activities. James realized that the medical conspiracy he had discovered earlier was probably being funded, at least in part, by money stolen from sick children and disaster victims. As James continued to investigate, he found that the Queen's financial crimes extended beyond just stealing charity money. She had also been using her royal position to manipulate government contracts, ensuring that companies owned by her friends and family members received preferential treatment when competing for lucrative public projects. James discovered invoices for construction work on royal properties that had been massively overcharged, with the extra money being split between the Queen and the contractors. He found evidence of consulting fees being paid to shell companies for services that were never actually provided. He even found records showing that the Queen had been selling access to royal events, allowing wealthy individuals to buy their way into exclusive gatherings for prices that were never reported to the tax authorities. The scope of the financial manipulation was breathtaking. James estimated that the Queen had been stealing or misdirecting tens of millions of pounds over the years, all while maintaining her public image as someone dedicated to charitable work and public service. She had been using her royal status not to serve the people, but to rob them. What made the situation even worse was that James could see how the stolen money was being used. Instead of going to help people in need, it was being spent on luxury vacations, expensive jewelry, private jets, and lavish parties. The Queen was literally taking food out of the mouths of hungry children so that she could live an even more extravagant lifestyle than her royal position already provided. James also discovered that the Queen had been coaching other wealthy individuals on how to set up similar schemes, essentially teaching them how to steal from charities while avoiding detection. She had turned charity fraud into a business model that she was sharing with her friends, spreading the corruption throughout the upper levels of British society. As James sat in the Queen's office, surrounded by evidence of years of systematic theft from some of the most vulnerable people in society, he felt a rage unlike anything he had ever experienced. This wasn't just about political manipulation or even medical abuse anymore. This was about a woman who was stealing from sick children and disaster victims to fund her own greed and corruption. James Morrison had reached his limit. After weeks of discovering one horrifying truth after another, he knew he couldn't stay silent anymore. But when he tried to report what he had learned through the proper channels, he discovered that the Queen's influence reached much further than he had ever imagined. The first person James decided to approach was his direct supervisor, Commander Wilson, a man he had worked with for over 5 years. Wilson had always been fair and honest, someone who genuinely cared about the integrity of the Royal Protection Unit. If anyone would listen to James's concerns and take appropriate action, it would be him. James requested a private meeting with Wilson, claiming he had discovered some security issues that needed immediate attention. This wasn't technically a lie, since what James had uncovered certainly represented a threat to the royal family, even if it wasn't the kind of security threat that Wilson would be expecting. When they met in Wilson's office the next morning, James carefully explained what he had observed over the past several weeks. He started with the strange meeting he had witnessed, then described the pattern of isolation he had documented, and finally revealed the medical and financial conspiracies he had uncovered. He presented his notebook, showed Wilson the photographs he had taken, and even played some of the audio recordings he had managed to capture. Wilson listened to everything James had to say, asking occasional questions but mostly just taking notes. James felt relieved to finally be sharing this burden with someone who had the authority to do something about it. He expected Wilson to be shocked and angry, and to immediately begin an investigation into the Queen's activities. Instead, Wilson closed his notebook and looked at James with an expression that seemed more disappointed than surprised. He explained that James had put him in a very difficult position by bringing these allegations forward. He suggested that James might be misinterpreting what he had seen and heard, that royal politics could be complicated and confusing to someone who wasn't familiar with how these things normally worked. Wilson recommended that James take some time off to rest and think more carefully about what he believed he had witnessed. He suggested that the stress of the job might be affecting James's judgment, and that a few weeks away from work might help him gain some perspective on the situation. James was stunned. He had expected Wilson to take his concerns seriously, not to dismiss them as stress-related hallucinations. He tried to argue, pointing out the specific evidence he had gathered and the documentation he could provide. But Wilson seemed determined to treat the entire matter as a personnel issue rather than a legitimate security concern. The meeting ended with Wilson strongly advising James not to discuss his concerns with anyone else while he was on leave. He explained that spreading unsubstantiated rumors about members of the royal family could be considered a serious breach of security protocols and could result in criminal charges. James left the meeting feeling more isolated and confused than ever, but James refused to give up. After thinking about the situation for several days, he decided to approach the head of the entire Royal Protection Unit, Director Morrison. This was a much more serious step, going over his immediate supervisor's head, but James felt he had no choice given Wilson's reaction. Getting a meeting with Director Morrison required James to submit a formal written request, explaining the nature of his concerns. James spent hours crafting a careful document that outlined his discoveries without making any accusations that could be dismissed as speculation. He focused on the documented facts and let the evidence speak for itself. When the meeting finally took place a week later, James found himself sitting across from Director Morrison in an imposing office filled with photographs of the director meeting various members of the royal family over the years. James had only met the director a few times before, and he seemed like someone who took his responsibilities very seriously. James presented his case again, this time even more carefully and thoroughly than he had with Wilson. He had prepared additional documentation, organized his evidence more systematically, and practiced explaining the complex web of corruption he had uncovered. He felt confident that someone at Director Morrison's level would understand the seriousness of the situation. But once again, James found himself facing an unexpected response. Director Morrison listened politely to everything James had to say, but his questions focused more on how James had obtained his information than on what the information revealed. He seemed particularly concerned about James's methods of gathering evidence, suggesting that some of his actions might have violated privacy protocols. Director Morrison explained that the Royal Protection Unit had to maintain absolute trust with the people they protected, and that trust required respecting boundaries and maintaining confidentiality, even when they observed things that might seem concerning. He suggested that James's willingness to secretly record conversations and photograph private documents demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of his role and responsibilities. The director also mentioned that there had been some concerns raised about James's recent behavior and performance. Apparently, Wilson had filed reports noting that James seemed distracted and suspicious, and that his conduct had become questionable. Director Morrison suggested that James might benefit from a transfer to a different department where he could have a fresh start. James realized with growing horror that his attempts to report the Queen's crimes were being turned against him. Instead of being seen as a whistleblower trying to protect the royal family, he was being portrayed as a problem employee who couldn't be trusted. His evidence was being dismissed and his motives were being questioned. Over the following days, James noticed that his work assignments were changing. He was being moved away from positions that gave him access to sensitive information, and he was being paired with colleagues who seemed to be watching him more carefully than usual. It became clear that he was being gradually pushed out of his job. James tried reaching out to other people within the royal household who might be willing to listen to his concerns. He approached a senior secretary who had always seemed trustworthy, and a longtime staff member who had expressed private concerns about some of the changes happening in the household. But in each case, he found that people were reluctant to discuss anything that might be seen as critical of the Queen. Some of his colleagues seemed genuinely afraid to even acknowledge that there might be problems within the royal household. Others appeared to have already been warned about James and his unreliable allegations. A few people were sympathetic but explained that they couldn't risk their own jobs by getting involved in something so serious and potentially dangerous. James began to understand that the Queen's influence extended throughout the entire royal establishment. She had either won people's loyalty through favors and benefits, or she had made them afraid of what might happen if they opposed her. The system that was supposed to protect the royal family from external threats had been corrupted from within. The final blow came when James received an official letter informing him that he was being transferred to a security position at a government building far from any royal residences. The transfer was described as a promotion, but James knew it was actually a way to remove him from any position where he could gather more evidence or cause problems for the Queen. James realized that he had been naive to think that the proper channels would provide any help. The people who should have been investigating the Queen's crimes were instead protecting her and punishing anyone who tried to expose her. The system was so thoroughly compromised that working within it was not just useless, it was dangerous. As James sat in his apartment that evening, looking at the transfer letter and thinking about everything that had happened, he understood that he had reached a crossroads. He could accept the transfer, keep quiet about what he knew, and try to rebuild his career in a different part of government service. Or he could take the much more dangerous step of going outside the system entirely. James Morrison knew that going outside the system would change his life forever, but he couldn't live with himself if he stayed silent. After days of sleepless nights and careful planning, he made the decision that would either save the monarchy or destroy his own future. He was going to contact journalists, the one group of people who might actually be interested in exposing the truth. Finding the right journalist wasn't as simple as James had initially thought. He couldn't just call any newspaper or television station and expect to be taken seriously. He needed someone with experience investigating powerful people, someone who wouldn't be intimidated by threats or influenced by money, and someone who had the resources to properly verify his evidence. James spent weeks researching different journalists and news organizations. He read articles, watched investigative reports, and tried to identify reporters who had a track record of exposing corruption in high places. He was looking for someone who had previously taken on dangerous stories and survived the consequences. Eventually, James identified 3 journalists who seemed like they might be willing and able to handle his story. The first was Helen Parker, an investigative reporter for a major newspaper who had previously exposed corruption in government contracts. The second was Michael Torres, a television journalist known for his fearless reporting on organized crime. The third was Rebecca Chen, a freelance investigative reporter who specialized in financial crimes and had won awards for her work exposing charity fraud. James decided to start with Rebecca Chen because her expertise in financial investigations made her the most likely to understand the charity fraud evidence he had uncovered. He also felt that a freelance journalist might be less susceptible to pressure from powerful people who might want to kill the story. Making contact with Rebecca required careful planning. James couldn't use his work phone or email, and he couldn't meet her anywhere that might be under surveillance. He created a new email account using a public computer at a library, and he reached out to Rebecca through an encrypted messaging service that he had researched online. James's initial message was brief and vague. He simply said that he was a government employee who had uncovered evidence of serious crimes involving high-profile individuals, and that he was looking for a journalist who might be interested in investigating the story. He didn't mention the royal family or provide any specific details that might identify him or his sources. Rebecca responded within 24 hours, expressing interest but asking for more information about the nature of the allegations and the quality of the evidence. James could tell from her questions that she was experienced in dealing with potential whistleblowers and knew how to evaluate whether a story was worth pursuing. Over the course of several encrypted exchanges, James gradually provided more details about what he had discovered. He described the pattern of isolation and control, the medical manipulation, and the financial crimes, though he still didn't identify the specific people involved. Rebecca's responses showed that she understood the seriousness of what James was describing and that she had the knowledge and experience needed to investigate these types of crimes. After a week of careful communication, Rebecca agreed to meet James in person to review his evidence. They arranged to meet at a small cafe in a busy part of London, where they could blend in with the crowd and where James could be reasonably confident that he wasn't being followed or monitored. The meeting took place on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. James arrived early and chose a table in the back corner where he could see everyone who entered the cafe. When Rebecca arrived, she was exactly what James had expected: professional, cautious, and clearly experienced in handling sensitive situations. James had prepared a careful presentation of his evidence, organizing everything into clear categories and providing documentation for each of his claims. He started by showing Rebecca his notebook with the detailed timeline of events he had observed. Then he presented the photographs he had taken of financial documents, followed by the audio recordings he had managed to capture. Rebecca listened carefully to everything James had to say, asking detailed questions about how he had obtained his evidence and what additional verification might be possible. She was particularly interested in the financial records, since those would be the easiest to independently verify through public records and other sources. What impressed James most was that Rebecca didn't seem shocked or skeptical about the scope of the corruption he was describing. She treated his allegations as serious possibilities that deserved investigation, rather than wild conspiracy theories that could be easily dismissed. Her questions focused on the evidence rather than on James's motives or mental state. After reviewing all of James's evidence, Rebecca explained that she believed his story was credible and important enough to warrant a full investigation. However, she also warned him about the risks he was taking by coming forward. She explained that powerful people had many ways of fighting back against journalists and whistleblowers, and that James should be prepared for serious consequences. Rebecca also explained that she would need to independently verify as much of James's evidence as possible before publishing anything. This would involve contacting other sources, reviewing public records, and possibly conducting surveillance of her own. She warned James that this process could take several months and that there was no guarantee that they would be able to gather enough verifiable evidence to publish a story. Over the following weeks, Rebecca began her investigation, while James continued to gather additional evidence from his position within the royal household. Even though he had been transferred to a different job, James still had some access to information, and he was able to provide Rebecca with updates about ongoing activities. Rebecca's investigation confirmed many of James's allegations. She was able to trace financial transactions that supported his claims about charity fraud, and she found additional evidence of suspicious activities that James hadn't even known about. She also identified other potential sources who might be willing to provide information about the Queen's activities. As Rebecca's investigation progressed, she began to understand that James's allegations were just the tip of the iceberg. The corruption he had uncovered was part of a much larger network of criminal activities that involved dozens of people and millions of pounds. The story was even bigger and more important than either of them had initially realized. Rebecca also discovered that other journalists had previously tried to investigate similar allegations but had been stopped by legal threats, financial pressure, or other forms of intimidation. The Queen's associates had developed sophisticated methods for suppressing unfavorable coverage, and several news organizations had killed stories rather than face the consequences of publication. This discovery made Rebecca even more determined to see the investigation through to completion. She began working with lawyers who specialized in press freedom issues, ensuring that her story would be legally bulletproof before publication. She also started coordinating with editors and publishers who had the courage and resources needed to withstand the inevitable backlash. As the investigation neared completion, Rebecca and James both knew that they were about to cross a line from which there would be no return. Once the story was published, James would almost certainly lose his job and face possible criminal charges for violating his oath of confidentiality. Rebecca would face legal challenges, death threats, and attempts to destroy her career and reputation. but both of them also understood that the stakes were too high for them to back down. They weren't just exposing individual crimes anymore. They were revealing a systematic corruption that threatened the very foundations of the British monarchy. If they stayed silent, the Queen would continue to abuse her power, steal from charities, and manipulate the king, possibly for decades to come. The final decision to publish came when Rebecca uncovered evidence that the Queen was planning to expand her criminal activities. She had apparently been encouraged by her success in avoiding detection and was beginning to involve other members of the royal family in her schemes. If something wasn't done soon, the corruption could spread throughout the entire royal household. James and Rebecca both knew that they had reached the point where they had to act, regardless of the personal consequences. The story broke on a cold Monday morning in March, and within hours it had become the biggest news story in Britain. Rebecca Chen's investigation was published simultaneously across multiple news platforms to prevent any single organization from being pressured to suppress it. The headline read, "Royal Guard exposes systematic corruption within palace walls," and the evidence James had provided was laid out in devastating detail. James Morrison watched the coverage from his small apartment, knowing that his life would never be the same again. His phone had been ringing constantly since dawn, with reporters from around the world trying to reach him for interviews. He had turned off the television after seeing his photograph displayed on every news channel, but he could hear his neighbors talking about the story in the hallway outside his door. The initial reaction from the palace was swift and predictable. Within 2 hours of publication, Buckingham Palace released a statement categorically, denying all allegations and describing them as malicious fabrications designed to damage the reputation of the monarchy. The statement claimed that James Morrison was a disgruntled former employee who had been dismissed for inappropriate conduct, and it suggested that his allegations were motivated by personal revenge rather than genuine concern. But Rebecca's investigation had been too thorough for these denials to be effective. She had independently verified the financial transactions James had discovered, found additional witnesses who corroborated his observations, and obtained expert analysis of the medical evidence. The documentation was so comprehensive that even the palace's most experienced public relations specialists struggled to discredit it. By the afternoon, other news organizations had begun their own investigations into the allegations. Journalists who had previously been reluctant to challenge the royal family were now competing to uncover additional evidence of corruption. International media outlets picked up the story, and within 24 hours it had become a global sensation. The financial markets reacted immediately to the news. The value of the British pound dropped as investors worried about political instability, and companies associated with royal charities saw their stock prices fall dramatically. Tourism organizations expressed concern about the impact on Britain's reputation and the potential decline in visitors who came to see royal landmarks. Political leaders found themselves in an impossible position. Members of Parliament were being asked to comment on allegations that could fundamentally challenge the constitutional role of the monarchy. But they had to be careful not to appear to be exploiting the crisis for political gain. The Prime Minister called for a thorough investigation, while expressing confidence that the truth would ultimately vindicate the royal family. As the days passed, the evidence became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Bank records obtained through legal channels confirmed many of the financial irregularities James had documented. Medical professionals who had previously worked with the royal household began speaking privately to journalists about concerns they had raised, but which had been ignored. Staff members who had been afraid to speak out while still employed started sharing their own observations about the Queen's behavior. James received both support and condemnation from the public. Thousands of people contacted him through social media to thank him for his courage in exposing corruption at the highest levels of government. Others accused him of betraying his oath and trying to destroy British traditions for personal fame. His apartment building was surrounded by reporters and protesters, forcing him to stay inside for his own safety. The legal consequences began almost immediately. James was formally dismissed from government service and faced potential criminal charges for violating the Official Secrets Act. His lawyers argued that he was protected as a whistleblower who had exposed criminal activity, but the government seemed determined to prosecute him as an example to other potential leakers. Rebecca, Chen faced her own challenges as powerful lawyers attempted to discredit her reporting and prevent further publication of evidence. Several major corporations that advertised with news organizations threatened to withdraw their support if coverage of the royal scandal continued. Death threats arrived at her office daily, and she was forced to hire personal security guards. The Queen's response evolved as it became clear that simple denials would not be sufficient. Her lawyers began a sophisticated campaign to undermine the credibility of the evidence, while simultaneously negotiating behind the scenes to limit the scope of any official investigation. They argued that much of the alleged criminal activity had actually been legitimate but misunderstood financial management. King Charles found himself in an unprecedented position. As more evidence emerged about his medical treatment, he began to understand that his own wife had been systematically manipulating his health and mental clarity. The realization that someone he trusted completely had been harming him for years was devastating both personally and psychologically. The King's own investigation into the allegations revealed the full scope of his isolation from friends, family, and advisors. He discovered that many of his recent decisions had been made while he was under the influence of medications that had been deliberately chosen to impair his judgment. The knowledge that years of his reign had been compromised by medical manipulation raised serious questions about the validity of his official actions during that period. Medical experts who reviewed the evidence of the King's treatment expressed shock at the systematic nature of the abuse. Professional medical organizations called for investigations into Dr. Hayes and other healthcare providers who had participated in the scheme. Several doctors who had previously been excluded from the King's care came forward to explain that they had been removed precisely because they had refused to participate in inappropriate treatment protocols. The charity fraud allegations led to investigations by multiple law enforcement agencies. Dozens of fake charitable organizations were shut down, and millions of pounds in stolen donations were traced to accounts controlled by the Queen and her associates. Victims of natural disasters and other tragedies who had expected help that never arrived finally understood why their suffering had been ignored. International reaction to the scandal was swift and severe. Commonwealth countries began questioning their continued association with a monarchy that appeared to be fundamentally corrupt. Several nations announced reviews of their constitutional arrangements, and some began serious discussions about becoming republics rather than maintaining ties to the British Crown. The broader implications for the British government became clear as investigations expanded. The corruption within the royal household had apparently influenced government policy in areas ranging from healthcare to international relations. Civil servants who had been pressured to make decisions that benefited the Queen's financial interests came forward to describe a shadow system of influence that had operated parallel to official government structures. Public opinion polls showed that support for the monarchy had collapsed to historic lows. Younger generations in particular expressed anger that their tax money had been supporting institutions that were systematically stealing from charities and manipulating vulnerable people. Protest demonstrations outside royal residences became daily occurrences, with crowds demanding accountability and reform. James Morrison, despite facing personal and legal consequences for his actions, expressed no regret about his decision to come forward. In his only public statement, he said that his oath had been to protect the Crown and the British people, and that exposing corruption within the royal family was the highest expression of that loyalty. He argued that saving the monarchy from those who would exploit it was more important than protecting any individual member of the royal family. As investigations continued and more evidence emerged, it became clear that the scandal James had exposed was not just about one corrupt individual, but about systemic failures that had allowed abuse of power to flourish unchecked for years. The British people were left to grapple with fundamental questions about accountability, transparency, and whether their most cherished institutions could survive the revelations that continued to unfold each day. The story that had begun with one guard's observations of suspicious behavior had evolved into a constitutional crisis that would reshape British society for generations to come.